Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome. My name is Farah Kiladar, and I'm the CEO of the World Affairs Council. Moving to today's event, please allow me to introduce our speaker, Dr. Shehata. Dr. Shehata is an associate professor of Middle East politics in the Department of International and Area Studies at the University of Oklahoma. He's a specialist in Egyptian politics and the Muslim Brotherhood, and has previously taught at Georgetown University, New York University, Columbia University, and the American University in Cairo. Dr. Shehata's work has been published widely in both academic and policy journals. His analysis and op-ed pieces have appeared in the New York Times, the International Herald Tribune, the Boston Globe, Al-Hayat, Al-Ahram Weekly, and other publications. He is the editor of the book, Islamist Politics in the Middle East, Movements and Change, which addresses a number of central questions in the study of Islamic politics. He is also currently working on his new book, The Muslim Brotherhood, From Opposition Movement to Political Power. And I've already tried to get him to commit to coming back to see us when that book comes out. Please join me in welcoming our speaker today, Dr. Shehata.
Well, thank you very much. In fact, there's been an update to the book title, at least. It's now entitled From Prison to the Presidential Palace and Back Again, since they're no longer in power. But first, I'd like to thank everyone at the World Affairs Council, Farah Kiladar, the CEO, and Chetna Beskota, who was very kind in arranging all of the logistics, Ivana, who was with me today at Memorial High School, which was incredibly impressive, and of course, Alan Livingston, an OU alum and someone I've had the pleasure of getting to know over the last year and a half being in this part of the country. Okay, so today I'm tasked with updating you on Egypt 4 years after the revolution. You'll notice that revolution is in quotation marks, and that's one of the things we're going to be thinking about today, whether a revolution actually occurred in Egypt or whether it was something other than that. And actually what occurred about a year and a half ago in Egypt. That is the removal of Mr. Morsi after massive demonstrations, but by the military, and whether that was a coup or whether that was something else. But I do want to preface my remarks today and in some senses apologize to any Egyptians who are in the room because, as all of you know, this is a very contentious subject. And I'm sure that regardless of what I say, not everyone is going to agree with me. I fashion myself a relatively neutral academic, although I'm Egyptian and I care a great deal about the country. But that's the first thing I want to say, that Egypt is deeply polarized in terms of an update before I kind of begin and try to explain what's happened in the last 4 years. If I were to give you a snapshot very briefly at the beginning in terms of an update, I would say that Egypt is incredibly polarized, more so than it has been at any time in the 20th century, really. It's a divided country. One major division, of course, is between Islamists and secular and liberal political actors and groups and so on. I think there's another division also, quite severe and growing, between the youth revolutionaries who instigated the uprising in 2011 and many of the established elements associated with the state, as well as many other Egyptians who, after 4 years of tumult, of demonstrations and political instability and economic suffering and so on, yearn for stability. And sometimes stability and democracy, at least in the framing that is prevalent now in Egypt, don't go very well together. Of course, also Egypt, a year and a half ago or so, in August of 2013, suffered a major trauma. And I think the country will be living with it for a generation or so. And that was the massacre of protesters, supporters of Mr. Morsi, on August 14th, 2013, after about 6 weeks of sit-ins in opposition to his ouster or removal, as it were. Human Rights Watch called it, quote, one of the world's largest killings of demonstrators in a single day in recent history, unquote. Since that time, of course, as you know, the Muslim Brotherhood has been declared illegal. It's also been designated as a terrorist organization. Mr. Morsi and thousands of Muslim Brotherhood members and sympathizers are in jail, as well as many others. In fact, Human Rights Watch estimates that there are 16,000 Egyptians in jail right now for political reasons. And if you were to ask other Egyptian groups, NGOs and human rights organizations like the Initiative on Personal Freedoms and so on in Cairo, their estimates range up to 21,000. I also probably don't need to inform you that Mr. Mubarak, who had been in power for 29 and a half years, was recently acquitted. And although he is in a military hospital, he is essentially a free man. His two sons have also now been acquitted, and they are no longer in jail. And just yesterday, the feared and loathed Minister of the Interior, Habib al-Adli, who served, and the Ministry of the Interior, I should tell you, was the boot of the Egyptian regime on the neck of the Egyptian people, has been acquitted as well, and so on, just yesterday. So deeply divided. Also in the last year, there have been tremendous restrictions on political freedom. A protest law was approved by the government in 2003, which the Guardian newspaper, the British newspaper, has labeled the anti-protest law, because it essentially makes peaceful protest almost impossible. I also probably don't need to remind you, if you've been following the papers, that there have been hundreds, in fact, over 1,000, about 1,400 people, in fact, who have been sentenced in mass court rulings to death. Now, none of them have been put to death, and it might be the case that none of them will be put to death. But the idea that there have been these really comical trials, which the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights has called, quote, a profound disgrace and a mockery of justice, that this takes place also, I think, leaves one questioning the state of the situation in the country right now. I also don't need to remind you that journalists are in jail, about a dozen. Some of them have been freed recently, including Peter Grest, who was at Al Jazeera. And the other Egyptian journalists who have been with him have been released from custody, but they still face charges and are technically out on bail. And of course, there are, as I said, about at least 10 other Egyptian journalists that don't make the papers, unfortunately, that are in jail. In addition to that, there has been a marked deterioration in the security situation in the country, unfortunately. And this has meant attacks on the police, assassinations of senior officers, attacks on military targets, and so on. And in fact, over the last year and a half, there have been 343 police and security officials who have been killed in acts of violence and terrorism and so on, in addition to civilians. And so my task today is really to try to explain how we got to where we are today, 4 years after 2011. That is 4 years after the Tahrir uprising that took place between January 25th, 2011 and February 11th, when Mr. Morsi was ousted. Because as you can remember, there was so much hope, so many aspirations during that period. I think many of us believed that this was really the beginning of a new era, a possible renaissance in Egypt and the rest of the Arab world. And unfortunately, that has not materialized. And so the question is, how did we get to where we are today, really? You can see the iconic image of Tahrir Square filled with hundreds of thousands of protesters. An image, a comical image, held up by a protester in Tahrir during those 18 days. And if any of you are soccer fans, you'll recognize it immediately. Mr. Mubarak is receiving a red card, ejection from the game. And on his shirt says, 30 عاماً من الفساد, 30 years of corruption. And so he is being ejected from the game. And he was ejected for some time. These were the slogans, of course, of the Egyptian uprising. The first one, first made famous in Tunisia, but then spread like wildfire across the whole Arab world. Oh, I have to. Okay. And so, as I said, we have had much politics in Egypt over the last 4 years. We have had 4 presidents a young Mr. Mubarak there on the left, on the top left-hand photo, on, in fact, the day that Anwar Sadat would be assassinated, October 6, 1981. We had Mr. Morsi's short-lived presidency, a leader in the Muslim Brotherhood organization for 1 year, the first democratically elected civilian president in Egyptian history. I could be dramatic and say in 7,000 years of Egyptian history. Maybe the last, I hope not, but we'll see. We had, of course, the interim president who took over, or who was appointed by the military as interim president, Adli Mansour, a name that no one knew in Egypt really, except people who were deeply followers of politics or legal matters. He was from the Supreme Constitutional Court. And then, of course, the current president of Egypt, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, a widely, or I should say, yes, widely among some segments of the population, and this gets to the point that I was making earlier about how Egypt is deeply polarized, a widely admired, in some senses, at some times, hysterically admired leader, partially for ejecting Mr. Morsi from the presidency, the Minister of Defense who did so, and who, until quite recently, wore a military uniform. But now, of course, after his resignation from the military and his candidacy for president, ran in presidential elections against one other candidate in May of 2014 and became president. So as I said, we have had a lot of politics in Egypt since the uprising in 2011, but the question is, are we any closer really to democracy? We've had several constitutional referendums, a constitutional referendum in March of 2011, immediately after Mr. Mubarak was ejected from office and so on. We have had parliamentary elections, several of them for the lower house of parliament, and then the now disbanded permanently upper house of parliament and so on. And we've had 2 presidential elections, one in 2012 that elected Mr. Morsi, and one more recently in 2014, which led to Mr. Abdel Fattah al-Sisi's presidency. And this is a quick way to think about, to periodize Egyptian history in that time, so we can kind of make sense of the different eras. Historians like to do this, and I think this is a fairly accurate or useful periodization. The first 17 months after Mr. Mubarak was ejected was a period in which the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, about 25 or so senior military officers, were in charge of the country without a parliament and without an elected president. And they, to a large extent, instituted the roadmap that was supposed to deliver democracy, but I would say, unfortunately, hasn't delivered the kind of democracy that I think many Egyptians had hoped for in 2011. The one-year rule of Mr. Morsi, a disastrous rule in which the country was incredibly mismanaged and became even more polarized, but nevertheless, he was democratically elected. And then, of course, the period after his ouster from office, beginning in the summer of 2013. And I think it is fair to say that if you do want to make sense of Egyptian politics, you really have to understand or come to terms with the role and history of the Egyptian military in contemporary politics from 1952 to the present. Because 1952, of course, was the year that the old regime, the monarchical regime, Egypt was a monarchy, was ousted as a result of a coup by senior military officers, in which the modern Republic of Egypt was established. And of course, like many militaries at the time in the 1950s and 60s that were deeply involved in politics, the Egyptian military was deeply involved in politics, and I would argue continues to be deeply involved in politics. And they entrenched themselves, in many senses, in different spheres of Egyptian public life, including in economic life. And I think that unless we understand this, and unless we understand the privileges and economic and political power that they have managed to secure and continue to secure, and their attempts, quite continuous and at times quite deadly attempts to maintain that power and so on, we can't understand Egyptian politics today. And for those of you who know the history, of course, here we have Gamal Abdel Nasser, who would become president of Egypt after Mohammed Naguib, the more senior officer, held the post for the first year and a half or so after the uprising. Abdel Nasser, of course, lasted in that post until he died prematurely in 1970. And then, of course, in this photo, this is, of course, it seems to be Anwar Sadat, maybe that's Anwar Sadat, who would, of course, follow Abdel Nasser as president. And since 1952 until the present, we have had 4 military presidents. As I said, we've had, let's see if my math is correct, Mohammed Naguib, Gamal Abdel Nasser, Anwar Sadat. Actually, we've had 5. Hosni Mubarak, who lasted in office 29 and a half years. Mr. Tantawi, who was Minister of Defense at the time, did not take the post of president, but he was the head of the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces. Mr. Mubarak's Minister of Defense, appointed Minister of Defense in 1991. And if you're a fan of reading the WikiLeaks cables, the US State Department referred to him as Mubarak's poodle in terms of as an explanation for why he lasted so long. And of course, that partially explains why so little progress was made in the period after the uprising, after Mr. Mubarak was ousted, and of course, most recently, Abdel Fattah el-Sisi. Now, after the uprising in 2011, Egyptians wanted change. They wanted a new constitution, they wanted a new parliament, an elected parliament as a result of free and fair elections, and they wanted free and fair presidential elections. What they got first was, as I mentioned, a constitutional referendum, a limited constitutional referendum, several months after Mr. Mubarak was ousted in March, that really only set the ground rules for candidacy for presidential elections. But the first national elections that took place in Egypt took place in late 2011, at the beginning of 2012, for the lower house of the Egyptian parliament at the time, and they were deeply contentious. And this is another factor that one needs to understand in order to understand Egyptian politics and where it is today. The extent of polarization in Egyptian society, politically and otherwise, and of course, this reflects this. The polarization between Islamist political forces, like the Muslim Brotherhood, and more literalist, more extreme, more conservative, Salafi Islamist political forces, who are even to the right of the Muslim Brotherhood, and then secular and liberal political actors. Liberal sometimes, liberal in quotation marks at other times. And this was the result of the first parliamentary elections in December of 2011, in which Islamists, but of course Islamists who were competing with one another, secured the majority of seats in parliament, 70% of the seats, whereas liberal and secular forces did quite poorly, securing only 20% of the seats. Following those parliamentary elections, and not immediately, after many demonstrations and protests and so forth, and much blood unfortunately spilled on the streets, we had presidential elections the following summer. In the summer of 2012, beginning in May 2012, we had presidential elections. There were initially more than 10 candidates who ran. Of course, we have a system in Egypt, like many other systems, where it's not dominated by 2 political parties, so there were multiple candidates, but no single candidate secured 50% plus 1 of the vote in the first round, and that necessitated a second round. But unfortunately, and also reflecting the deep political polarization that I mentioned a moment ago, the 2 top vote getters were extremely polarizing individuals. Mohammed Morsi, who would eventually become the president, a leader in the Muslim Brotherhood Party. At the time, he was the head of their political arm, the Freedom and Justice Party. Incidentally, as you might know, an engineer and professor of engineering, a graduate of the University of Southern California. And Ahmed Shafiq, who was a military man, the ex-head of the Air Force under Mubarak, an insider in the Mubarak regime, and also President Mubarak's last prime minister, who was appointed prime minister in the last days of the Mubarak regime, after the uprising got underway. And these were intensely polarizing individuals, as you can imagine, because the choice in front of Egyptians was a stark one. Do you want to vote for a member of the Muslim Brotherhood? Or do you want to vote for someone who represents the old regime? Egyptians had a very difficult choice, especially those youth revolutionaries and others who I think were genuinely interested in a liberal, secular, progressive Egypt and so on. Do you vote for an Islamist, or do you vote for someone who is at least tainted, if not more so, by the old regime? We say that many people had to hold their nose when they cast their ballot, casting their ballot for the lesser of two evils rather than casting their ballot positively for the candidate that they actually wanted to win. The second round of the elections was also quite close, but of course Mr. Morsi came out on top. But you might recall that it took about a week for the election commission to tally the votes and to determine the outcome, and this caused even greater tension in Egypt, as well as allegations of electoral fraud and interference by foreign powers and so on, which I have to say led to the slight diminishing of the credibility of the elections, of the election results. But in the end, Mr. Morsi was declared the winner, and he became Egypt's first democratically elected president. As I said, one way of understanding the conflict in Egypt, or the situation in Egypt right now, is to understand the historic role of the Egyptian military in politics. A military that has not been subservient to civilian authority, a military that has a great deal of autonomy, a military whose doings and budgets and internal workings has no transparency whatsoever. But another way to understand Egyptian politics, I think, that gets us some leverage in understanding Egyptian politics, is to understand Egyptian politics, at least the period after Mr. Mubarak was ousted, as really a struggle about power as well as the identity of the nation, the character of the nation, what Egyptians and how Egyptians envisage the future, what kind of a country and a constitution and a nation and an identity did they want for themselves. Was it one that was heavily influenced by their religion, as it were, Islam and so on, the vision of Egypt that the Muslim Brotherhood and Islamists had, or was it one that recognized that but nevertheless tried to separate, to some extent, religion from politics? And I have to say, we have a bias in this country about that separation and so on, which has worked out somewhat well in this country. I would argue, in fact, that at times it doesn't seem like there is a separation between religion and politics. Remember, I'm coming from Oklahoma, right? And so on. But nevertheless, in theory at least, there's a separation between religion and politics. But the other side of that struggle, and this struggle manifested itself in the writing of the Constitution. What role would Islam have and the Sharia have in the Constitution? What role would religious authorities have in the Constitution and so on? A struggle over the self-conception of the nation. But the other side of that struggle, much more naked and much more crude, was a struggle over political power among different actors, among Islamists, among secular and liberal groups, among youth, and also among the military, the security intelligence agencies, what many of us call in Egypt the deep state. Of course, we know what happened. Mr. Morsi won the election, and this is a picture of him immediately after he swore the oath of office. He went to Tahrir Square in front of thousands of people and gave a speech, and of course, he was soon on the cover of Time magazine, and in fact, quite celebrated in the first few weeks and months of his presidency. You might remember that about a month into office, he retired the defense minister as well as the army chief of staff, to great popular delight, because of course the revolutionaries, the youth, people who had a somewhat critical view of the military and their relationship to the Mubarak regime, thought this was a step forward. And really that was the height of Mr. Morsi's popularity. It went downhill quite quickly after that, unfortunately. And his year in office, of course, as I said, he removed the Field Marshal Tantawi and General Sami Anan. He went to Iran, which was quite interesting. Going to Iran, Egypt does not have full diplomatic relations with Iran. He went to Iran, but he also scolded the Iranian regime for their support of Bashar al-Assad and his killing machine in Syria. So that was a quite interesting development. And of course, he won praise from the American administration, from President Obama, as well as Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, who was in Egypt in November, because you'll recall there was a week-long period of fighting between Hamas and Israel at that time, and Mr. Morsi was able to bring that fighting to an end in a relatively short period of time, unlike what we saw last summer in the period of about a week. Unfortunately, things went precipitously downhill immediately afterwards. One day after he won the praise of Mr. Obama and other heads of state for his mediation of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, he put forward a constitutional declaration that put him and his edicts above judicial review. And again, it is very complicated and difficult to understand Egyptian politics without understanding both sides, both perspectives. From Mr. Morsi's perspective, Egypt was without a constitution. And not having a constitution was a major obstacle for political stability and progress. And Egypt needed a constitution, and in fact, he was, as you will see in a moment, quite suspicious of attempts by old Mubarak regime insiders in the judiciary and other parts of the state to subvert and sabotage Egypt's efforts towards democratic progress and so on. So he issued this constitutional declaration, which was immediately and widely criticized as an authoritarian overreach, giving himself more powers even than Mr. Mubarak. And that was correct. He did say afterwards that this constitutional declaration, giving his edicts, making them impervious to judicial review and so on, would be short-lived until the Constitution was passed, which was the case. But no matter, that was the beginning of the end of Mr. Morsi, because that really brought all other political forces together against Mr. Morsi if they weren't at that time already. And things got significantly bad for him. We had immediately the formation of what was called the National Salvation Front by most of the political parties. We had protests which turned quite deadly in front of the presidential palace, in which there were accusations that Muslim Brotherhood thugs beat up peaceful protesters who were in front of the presidential palace objecting to the constitutional declaration and the Islamist-dominated constitution that Mr. Morsi was trying to ram down the throats of Egyptians at this time, which is quite right. It was a farcical constitution writing process in which the Constituent Assembly stayed up several nights in a row to finish the document, the way that my undergraduate students finish their papers and so on. But we're talking about a constitution here, something much more significant, and we saw continuing violence throughout that period and so on. And then in April 2013, we saw the emergence of a youth group committed to opposing Mr. Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood and mobilizing millions of people to do so. First collecting signatures on a petition, and then, of course, trying to organize mass demonstrations, which were ultimately successful in June of 2013. Now, I apologize that the next two slides have no nice pictures. And you probably won't be able to even read the text that's up there. But I will give you the headlines and try to explain it. But they are the two most important slides in my presentation this evening. And the reason is because I believe firmly that you can only understand Egyptian politics if you understand the fact that in Egypt at the time and in Egypt today, there are two wildly contrasting narratives about the situation in the country. Two narratives that are diametrically opposed, that are mutually exclusive. A narrative that is the Muslim Brotherhood, or an Islamist narrative, largely, and a narrative that is a secular, liberal, quote-unquote, narrative. Now, the difficulty in this, and that helps us explain the polarization in Egypt, the difficulty in this, what's really quite fascinating, is that both narratives are correct simultaneously. And that is why the country is so polarized. So in Mr. Morsi's narrative, in the Muslim Brotherhood narrative, Mr. Morsi came to power in a country in which a revolution did really not take place. It was only the removal of Mr. Mubarak, but the Mubarak regime was still there, and they were out to get him. And they dissolved that parliament that was Islamist dominated on a technical reason, simply to subvert him. And the Mubarak appointees and so on in different parts of the government were out to get him, as were the military and so on. The Ministry of the Interior, which has not been reformed, were the individuals who had put Mr. Morsi and his compatriots in the Muslim Brotherhood in jail, and they were still functioning and up and running. When he looked at the opposition groups that were really impotent at the ballot box, the Muslim Brotherhood and Mr. Morsi, he noted that they were impotent, but he also questioned their sincerity to democracy. They were, as I've written in the New York Times, Democrats as long as Islamists didn't win at the ballot box, right? And that was his view of them and so on. When he looked at the judiciary, he saw a number of Mubarak appointees and so on. The same ones we're seeing these days ruling those mass death penalty rulings and so on. When he looked at the Egyptian media, particularly the state-controlled media, which is quite large, both print as well as television, in addition to the privately owned television stations, he saw a psychological warfare against him and the Muslim Brotherhood waged quite successfully, I might add. And he also saw direct efforts to sabotage his popularity and presidency and the workings of the country through the creation of artificial fuel shortages. In Egypt, in May and April and March of 2013, if you wanted to fill your car up with gasoline, you probably had to wait 3 or 4 hours at the gas pump because there were shortages of both gasoline and diesel. And there were also, but these have continued, there were also electricity outages that summer and so on, which have continued. But magically, the fuel shortages immediately went away when Mr. Morsi was ousted. And there's some evidence, even according to the New York Times, that they were manufactured to increase opposition and displeasure among millions, which was quite successful to Mr. Morsi's rule. So this was Mr. Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood's worldview, their assessment of the situation in Egypt and so on. And of course, when they looked at their neighbors, they saw hostile powers to both democracy and Islamist politics in Israel and in the Gulf states and elsewhere. Now, there's also another worldview that, as I said, is also correct, completely correct, in fact, that looked at the world quite differently. And that was the secular, liberal, quote-unquote, worldview. And when secular forces and liberal individuals looked at Egypt in 2013 under Mr. Morsi, what did they see? They saw a Muslim Brotherhood and Mr. Morsi who was not genuinely committed to liberal democracy, meaning rights for all Egyptians equally, equal rights for Christians, equal rights for Muslims, equal rights for women, equal rights for men. That was not really the commitment, the full democratic, liberal democratic commitments of the Muslim Brotherhood, and they were right. They saw that Mr. Morsi ruled as really the head of the Muslim Brotherhood and not the head or the ruler of all Egyptians. When they looked at his presidency, they saw him attempting to consolidate his own power rather than governing. When they looked at the campaign promises that he had made, particularly in the weeks before the runoff, when he promised to appoint publicly, and this is on record, a Christian as vice president and a woman as vice president. Those were unfulfilled campaign promises. When they looked at his November 22nd constitutional declaration, when he put himself above judicial review, they saw an autocrat, and so on, trying to increase his power. When they looked at the violence that occurred in December in opposition to the Constitutional Declaration, they saw Muslim Brotherhood sanctioned violence against civilian protesters and so on. They also saw, gross incompetence and mismanagement. This was a movement that was really not prepared, even on their own admission, to govern a country, let alone govern a country of 90 million people with profound challenges. That's putting it politely. Profound challenges and so on, where 20% of the population live below poverty and another 20% of the population live very close to the poverty line. They also saw no improvement whatsoever in terms of security. Security had deteriorated in Egypt after the uprising against Mubarak. I would argue that it was an intentional policy of the withdrawal of effort and policing by the security forces, kind of blackmailing the public. Remember, they were the boot of the Egyptian regime on the neck of the Egyptian people. And quite frankly, they were saying to Egyptians under their breath, you want a revolution? You can have it. We're not going to police. We're not going to keep your streets safe. We're not going to do our work. And crime went up. Crime went up statistically, and it also went up in terms of anecdotal evidence. Just in my own family, our house was broken into in Alexandria, something unheard of before. My mother-in-law's car was stolen. There were kidnappings and so on. And so there was a lack of security and a lack of improvement in the economy and so on, which Mr. Morsi had promised. They also saw, secular and liberal individuals, when they looked at Egypt under Mr. Morsi, they saw something that they called the brotherhoodization of the state. In other words, they believed that Mr. Morsi was trying to infiltrate the state with his appointees and with Muslim Brotherhood members, possibly making his electoral defeat or their electoral defeat in the future impossible. This is at least their vision. Most of this or some of this is correct. There's some basis of fact in this, and much of it is correct, but maybe not all of it. And of course, the revolutionary youth saw Mr. Morsi unwilling to take on the security sector, the Ministry of the Interior, as well as the military, and to try to genuinely democratize and to reform them. They also saw increased sectarian tensions between Christians and Muslims. And this is the great dilemma in Egypt. These are two mutually exclusive worldviews, but they're both largely correct, or there's some factual basis for both of them, as it were. We saw, of course, during that period of rule that Mr. Morsi was in office, his popularity decreased significantly. When he was elected, he had a popularity approval rate of 76% by the time he was ousted from power in a popularly supported coup, to try to be accurate. His popularity had deteriorated to 32% and so on. And as I mentioned, by March, April of 2013, a youth opposition movement had developed against Mr. Morsi. You can see it visually represented here in some graffiti. Graffiti art has taken off in Egypt and the Arab world after the uprisings. Here is Mr. Morsi drawn, interesting outfit, on the wall of a building, and this rebel group called Tamarrud, which means rebel in Arabic, is kind of hitting him in the face, as it were. And this youth rebel group had the idea to organize a petition and get millions of Egyptians to sign the petition, essentially withdrawing their confidence in the president, asking for early elections, claiming that nothing had improved in Egypt, and withdrawing their faith in the president. And their goal was to get 15 million signatures, 1 million more signatures than the number of votes Morsi got in presidential elections. And they also called for massive protests to take place on June 30th, 2013. And in fact, I remember in the weeks up to June 30th, just as in the days up to January 25th, we had really no idea how many people would be mobilized on June 30th. And in fact, they were incredibly successful because they claim to have reached 22 million signatures. I think that's wildly inaccurate. They got millions of signatures, probably not even 14 million, but they got millions of signatures. But what's most impressive is, and regardless of what you think about Mr. Morsi or the Muslim Brotherhood or President Sisi or whatever it might be, it is the case that on June 30th, 2013, more Egyptians went out onto the streets to protest than at any time in Egyptian history. And in fact, more than any of those 18 days, those magical 18 days of protest against the Mubarak regime in 2011. That certainly is the case. And here you see, of course, some of the protests in Tahrir Square, quite ingeniously and creatively projecting game over in on the Mugamma building, the major state kind of Kafkaesque Stalinist architectural structure in Tahrir Square. A poster of Mr. Morsi, of course, with the X written on it, "The End of Brotherhood Rule" on 630, a creative play on the Time magazine cover, "Time to Go," and then, of course, raising up the picture of Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, at the time the defense minister, who ironically Mr. Morsi appointed himself in August 2012 when he forcibly retired those two other senior military officers and so on. And of course, Mr. Sisi, seeing all of this, gave the president 48 hours to resolve his differences with the opposition, which was essentially 48 hours to get ready to go to prison. And then 48 hours later, on July 3rd, General Sisi, General Sisi at the time, he became a field marshal later, had a news conference on the evening of July 3rd with representatives of the military as well as the Pope of the Egyptian Coptic Church and the head, the Sheikh of Al-Azhar University, the oldest site of Islamic learning in the world, as well as a few civilian political figures like the sleeping Muhammad al-Baradei here on the left and a member of the Salafi Noor party in the back. Very important that he was present because he represented the fact that Islamists were also opposed to Mr. Morsi. Well, that's true or not, it doesn't matter, but he was there at least. Interesting also to know, and I have put here what was the relationship between Tamarud and the military, because there's a great deal of work that's been done and some speculation about whether there was cooperation between the military and this youth movement in terms of both having the common interest of removing Mr. Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood from power. And of course, one simple form of cooperation, or at least encouragement, is this. On June 30th, the day of the major protests, we saw Egyptian jets, American-made Egyptian jets, drawing hearts in the sky of Cairo, F-16s, to encourage the millions of protesters who were on the streets below, in addition to Egyptian helicopters with flags and so on. And a famous movie director who was given a helicopter so he could fly above Cairo and film the massive demonstrations and so on. Okay, of course, Mr. Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood supporters didn't go easily. They also then, in reaction to Mr. Morsi's ouster, organized their own protests and sit-ins. Thousands of them, tens of thousands of them, demonstrated across the country, in Cairo, Alexandria, and other cities. But really, they focused on two locations in Cairo. A location in a part of Cairo, in a square in Cairo called Rab al-Adawiyya, in which they organized a continuous sit-in, a kind of tent city, to protest the coup, and in another smaller location closer to Cairo University, closer to the center of the city, where tens of thousands of them, at least in the first sit-in, occupied the square and the surrounding areas for essentially 6 weeks in protest of the coup. This lasted, as I said, from July to August 14th. because at that time, at the beginning of August, the new military-backed government had declared that they were going to disperse the sit-ins, that the sit-ins were impeding life in the area, that there were all kinds of illegal activities, including violence and so on, taking place there, and that they were going to forcibly disperse them. And in fact, they did disperse them. On August 14th, 2013, you'll remember the quotation that I read from Kenneth Roth, the executive director at Human Rights Watch, talking about this as Egypt's Tiananmen Square. But in fact, more Egyptians died on this day than at Tiananmen Square. We think well over 800 certainly died that day, and there were several thousand who were injured. But you'll remember that I talked to you about two narratives, two mutually exclusive, contrasting narratives about what has happened in Egypt over the last several years. The other narrative that was quite visible on Egyptian media, state media and so on, was that there was violence among the protesters, that these were not peaceful sit-ins, that not only were they disrupting life for the residents of the area and so on, but that there were people who had weapons and arms who were firing upon security forces and so on. And these images of people who were in the sit-ins with weapons were continuously played on Egyptian state television as proof or as evidence that these were not peaceful sit-ins, that they were violent and that they were against the law and so on. And you can see here on one of the, I've translated this here, it says, anyone who asks you, how did you know he was a Muslim brother about these, things, send him this picture, right? Muslim Brotherhood carrying firearms and firing at police, so that no one asks, why didn't the Brotherhood didn't use weapons? In other words, the Brotherhood had weapons, this is the argument at least, and that the dispersal of the sit-ins was necessary. At least that's the argument. Now, unfortunately, violence begets violence, and immediately after the dispersal of the sit-ins and the deaths and so on, we saw a rampage in Egypt of increasing violence, particularly directed against the Egyptian Christian community, in which there were well over 50 churches that were burned to the ground in different parts of Egypt, many of them in Upper Egypt or in the southern part of the country, where there are a large percentage of Christians. The idea, at least, was that supporters of the Muslim Brotherhood held the Christian population largely or significantly responsible for Mr. Morsi's ouster. That's at least the thinking behind the abominable destruction of these churches, in addition to some Christian businesses. We also saw the beginning of significant violence and terrorism in Egypt at this time. There has been a deterioration in the rule of law and the security situation since Mr. Mubarak was ousted, but we saw things really deteriorate after Mr. Morsi was ousted, with the rise of terrorist groups in Sinai, and in fact terrorist groups that are now affiliated with ISIS. They've recently changed their name from Supporters of Jerusalem to Sinai Province, right, several months ago, and pledged allegiance to Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi and have begun beheadings and other terrible things. But we also saw the use of car bombs in this attempted assassination of the Minister of Interior and so on. We also saw by Egyptian state officials and so on begin to use a discourse of a war on terrorism, that Egypt was engaged in a war on terrorism against these Islamists, extremists, and terrorists and so on. Here we have Egypt's prime minister at the time, Hazem Biblawi, a Sorbonne-educated economist, talking about Egypt's fight on terrorism. Egypt's former foreign minister, Nabil Fahmy, the same thing. A Supreme Constitutional Court judge, this idea that Egypt is in a war on terrorism and that extra measures need to be taken in these unusual times and so on. There have been continued since that time demonstrations in favor of Mr. Morsi, in favor of the Muslim Brotherhood. Here we see some images of some at Cairo University and in other parts of the country, objecting to the removal and also commemorating the massacre at the square. And this is the symbol here, the four-finger symbol, which is outlawed in Egypt now and can get you put in jail if you have one of these things. And the reason behind this is because the square is called, or the name of the square, Raba al-Adawiya, the fourth Adawiya square. And so this is a reference to that square, as it were, and the violence that was done there. We've seen, of course, in the aftermath of the popularly supported coup, to be careful, a crackdown on the Muslim Brotherhood, with many Muslim Brotherhood leaders put in jail, as well as supporters, and so on. Here we have the former Speaker of Parliament, we have the Deputy Guide of the Muslim Brotherhood, another leading official, Assam El-Arian, who was also a member of Parliament, and so on, all put in jail. And many of them, some of them are on trial, some of them have received verdicts already. And of course, this is the title of the book, How It's Changed. We have Mr. Morsi here, on the day that he was sworn into office, becoming president. Here he is meeting with Secretary Clinton during the Gaza crisis. Here's his mugshot photo that was put on the front page of the Egyptian papers. And here's a recent photo of Mr. Morsi in a cage on trial on a number of different charges, treason as well as violence against civilians and so on. And so the title will now, comically be From Prison to the Presidential Palace and Back Again, because actually Mr. Morsi was imprisoned during the uprising against Mr. Mubarak. And so he went from prison, like the Muslim Brotherhood, faced a period of repression under Mr. Mubarak's rule, to the heights of power and the presidency, or at least seeming power, and then of course now they are in prison. But in addition to the repression against the Muslim Brotherhood and the curtailment of political freedoms in Egypt against Islamists, we've also seen in this last year or so a significant deterioration in political freedoms and political space for non-Islamists as well. And we have seen hundreds of youth activists, secular liberal youth activists, many of them opposed Mr. Morsi and took part in those June 30th demonstrations. Many of them were the ones who were the instigators, the organizers of the January 25, 2011 demonstrations against Mr. Mubarak, like Ahmed Maher, the head of the April 6th group, like Ala Abdel Fattah, who was recently sentenced to jail and so on, like, of course, Bassem Youssef, the satirist, often referred to as Egypt's equivalent to Jon Stewart, who, although not in jail, his show has been taken off the air, and he has, not allowed really to continue his satirical political show. And of course, the journalists, you'll see here, Peter Grest and the two other Al Jazeera Egyptian journalists, but as I said, many others are in jail as well. So there's been a general increase or curtailment of political freedoms and an increase in political repression, as I mentioned at the beginning of my talk. Now, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but this just simply tells you in numbers some of the figures behind the numbers of those in jail, the number of deaths, terrorism-related deaths, and so on, that have increased quite significantly. And I'll just note that this is actually not even up until the present. This is just between the date of the popularly supported coup and 2014, and those figures unfortunately have increased since that time. Now, of course, after Mr. Morsi was removed from office, the Transitional Roadmap, as it were, called for a new constitution, a constitution that was not an Islamist-inspired constitution, as well as presidential elections. Those took place in January and June of 2014. The Constitution passed overwhelmingly, and then Mr. Sisi was elected president overwhelmingly with 96% of the vote, as it were. As I said at the beginning, if we think about where we are now after 4 years, Mubarak is acquitted and his sons are free. Mr. Morsi is in jail. Thousands of Brotherhood members are in jail. Many of the young secular liberal activists are now also in jail. The new protest law virtually bans protests. Many journalists in jail, political repression, increase in political violence, and terrorism. Just to end with something that maybe you might find particularly interesting. This has also been, particularly the period from Mr. Morsi's ouster until the present, a tense moment in U.S.-Egyptian relations. And in fact, the Obama administration didn't know how to react, really, to Mr. Morsi's ouster. And they debated among themselves whether to call it a coup, whether to call it something else, and so on. And this caused, and of course they were quite critical with, at least to the cameras and so on. But in fact, in terms of real relations, not that much has changed. Business as usual, really. But they did make some critical remarks about the use of repression, the number of deaths, and so on, the mass arrests. And this has led to some tension, in fact, in the U.S.-Egyptian relationship. And one of the consequences of that tension is that Mr. Sisi, President Sisi, has had a really quite different foreign orientation over the last year and a half. While he was defense minister, after Mr. Morsi was ousted, you'll see he's still wearing the military uniform. He made a trip to Russia after the Russian foreign minister and the defense minister visited Cairo to begin an arms deal. That was his first trip to Russia, I believe in February of 2014, where he met Vladimir Putin. And in fact, at the time, it was widely rumored that he was going to remove his military uniform and become a civilian and thus a presidential candidate. And during the meetings, Mr. Putin said to him, and this was in the papers, "Oh, I encourage you to do so. I think it would be good for Egypt, and I support your candidacy, as do the Russian people." And sure enough, that's what happened. He's made a subsequent trip to Russia, actually, and an arms deal has been signed. And in fact, quite recently, a couple of weeks ago in February, Mr. Putin came to Cairo, and you can see him here giving President Sisi a gift. And what is that gift, I wonder? It is an AK-47, a special AK-47. Of course, Mr. Sisi has also visited China to encourage Chinese investment in Egypt, tourism, but as well as infrastructural projects and so on. That was in December of 2014. And so I think I will end with that in terms of my talk on Egypt 4 years after, and I will thank you and be happy to take some questions.
The handheld or this? Thank you, Dr. Shehata. I recognize that we've reached, it's 7 p.m. already, but I would hate to miss out on an opportunity to ask questions, so we'll direct a few questions. Egypt and Israel are having a joint effort to avoid terrorism in the Sinai Peninsula. How do you see their relationship in the future?
Sure. Well, all Egyptian governments, of course, have a mutual interest in stability and security in the Sinai Peninsula. Egyptian governments as well as Israeli governments. Sinai is a major source of revenue because it's a tourist destination for Egypt. Egypt, of course, is a country that tourism is quite important for the economy. There were, before the uprising, about 12 or 13 million tourists who would come a year. Tourism employs about 3 million Egyptians. It's a source of hard revenue. And when there are terrorist attacks and bombings and so on in Sinai, Egyptian business and economy and people suffer as well. So the Camp David peace accords, the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty, were really never in question. And of course, there's really been never any talk about abrogating that relationship and those peace accords. It is true, however, that the Israeli government is much more fond of the present government in Egypt right now than they were of the Muslim Brotherhood. And in fact, they, as well as the Saudi, Kuwaiti, and Emirati governments, have tried to convince the American administration not to be as critical with regard to Egypt and human rights violations and so on as they have been. So I anticipate, continuing cooperation between the Egyptian and the Israeli governments with regard to these kinds of issues.
With the rise of ISIS in the region, what do you see the future for them in Egypt?
Well, this issue of ISIS is quite interesting because You know, we see ISIS popping up in Libya and in Egypt and in Afghanistan and so on, but don't be fooled, really. I mean, it's quite troubling, of course, but largely this is not ISIS fighters in the heartland of Syria and Iraq getting on commercial planes and going to Egypt and Afghanistan. These are local groups that had been in operation before. In Egypt, as I said, this group was called Ansar Beit al-Maqdis, supporters of Jerusalem, that really latched on quite recently to the brand name of ISIS. And they've adopted ISIS's tactics, as well as pledging allegiance to the supposed caliph and so on. And they are a security threat, not to the whole regime, but to movement in Sinai and to the security forces and so on. I think that the security situation in Egypt is not going to qualitatively improve unless the political situation improves, unfortunately.
How do you see a new U.S. administration, be it in the guise of Hillary Clinton or Jeb Bush, in relation to the relationship with Egypt?
Sure.
Or anyone else?
Right. Well, what's interesting to note is, as I said before, that there has been this tension in the U.S.-Egyptian relationship at one level. There were some criticisms leveled at the Egyptian administration for human rights issues and so on. There was the suspension of military aid, of some military aid, the putting on hold delivering of some military helicopters, some Black Hawk helicopters and so on. You know, but really, in essence, the United States has never and will never, unfortunately, prioritize issues of human rights, democracy, rule of law over issues that they see are national security issues. So in essence, the relationship, you know, there's been some hurt feelings and so on and misunderstandings, particularly on the Egyptian side, who have been critical of the United States because they felt that the U.S. supported the Muslim Brotherhood or something like that, which of course I think is quite laughable. But I think that, you know, both Hillary Clinton or Mr. Bush or others would continue to want the relationship to be good. It might be a little bit better if it was a Republican administration from the perspective of the Egyptian government.
In fact, taking from your comment, I've got a question from, I'm guessing, an Egyptian. Why do you keep repeating the word coup? All, if not most people in Egypt hate the strong use of word. And that, you know, the current regime has 90% of support or more.
Sure. Well, that's not exactly true, in fact. And we have statistics that demonstrate that. You are correct that, let's see if I have them here with me. See if I have them here with me. You are correct that we believe that the ouster of, let me answer the question and then I'll give you some data. Any non-democratic transfer of power without the use of elections is a coup, right? Especially if military officers take part in it. Now, I tried to be careful and I've tried to say a popularly supported coup. And I've also said that millions of Egyptians, more than in any time in Egyptian history, more than during those 18 days, went out onto the streets to oppose Mr. Morsi and supported his removal. Do we have accurate figures on how many Egyptians there were? Was it the majority of Egyptians? No, there's no data on that. Was the military involved in the removal of a democratically elected president? Yes, they were. Is that a coup in terms of scholastic definitions of a coup? Yes, it was a coup. Was it right or wrong? That's another question. And so I understand that people might oppose Mr. Morsi so much and therefore they don't want to call it a coup and so on. You know, you're going to have to live with it, unfortunately. That's the case, right? And it doesn't mean that it wasn't necessary and so on, but that is certainly the case. And in fact, in terms of data, as I said, interestingly enough, and this is from an Egyptian respected organization, the majority of Egyptians in this polling data did not sympathize with the Muslim Brotherhood and in fact were satisfied with the way the sit-ins were dispersed. This isn't exactly about the coup, but it's about the dispersal of the sit-ins on August 14th. And we see that 67% were satisfied. We think, you know, there's some degree of accuracy in this. We don't know and so on. But if you look at the more recent polling done by the Pew organization, we see a deeply divided Egypt. So I don't want to hear this 90% anymore, right? We see that 54% favored the ouster of Morsi. Okay, fine, 54%. The ouster, through non-democratic institutional means, mind you. But we see, of course, in terms of views of General turned President Sisi, we see only 54% versus 45%. So I don't want to hear this 90% anymore. This is a deeply divided issue. Of course, there's something else to be said as well. And this kind of gets us to a little bit, more scholastic or scholarly issues. The opposition to Morsi was largely, not entirely, an urban phenomena. And you could only get the numbers because there's a class dynamic going on here, right, and a regional dynamic. Mr. Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood are not the Cairo elite. They are not those who have gone to the American University in Cairo or the military academy and so on. They are middle class, lower middle class, aspirants to higher positions. They're the new kids on the block. They are what Recep Tayyip Erdogan was in Turkey a decade and a half ago, a new aspiring elite. And so we see also a regional dynamic here. We don't know what the popularity of Mr. Morsi was outside of the major urban areas. And in fact, it's quite possible that his popularity was higher in those areas than in the major cities. And we have evidence of this. If you study the polling numbers in terms of the parliamentary elections in 2011 and 2012 and the presidential elections, you'll see that Mr. Morsi did not do well in urban centers. He lost Cairo. And he lost Alexandria. But he won other areas, more town, semi-rural areas. So it's not at all clear that it's 90% popularity and so on. And in fact, Mr. Sisi's popularity has been decreasing because of, as I said, the increased or the narrowing of political space and freedoms in Egypt over the last year, not only against the Muslim Brotherhood, but against the revolutionary youth and other groups and so on.
Would you not say that one of the main problems that Egypt had was rushing to the elections, rushing to the polls, equating democracy with elections and votes rather than institutions and waiting to develop those?
That's completely correct. The transition plan was a train wreck. It was a disaster in terms of how to try to organize an orderly transition to a consolidated democratic system with institutions and so on. Institutions that have buy-in, institutions that are popularly supported. The Constitution, and many parties are to blame for this, including the Muslim Brotherhood. I have tried to be quite objective in terms of my presentation of two narratives and two views. And so, for example, with regard to constitutions, we all know that constitutions are foundational documents that are supposed to be widely respected, not just today, but for decades, and have buy-in among the vast majority of the population. And therefore, a constitution is not enough to get an electoral approval of 50% plus one. This isn't a city council vote. This is something where you want the overwhelming majority of citizens to buy in. And unfortunately, the Muslim Brotherhood tried to ram down the throats of Egyptians a constitution that was supported by them, that was not written by a broad consensus. That's just one aspect of the mess of the transition process. But Egyptians debated about whether a constitution should come first, whether presidential elections should come first, and of course, we had the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces have their hand in the transition process, God knows for good or ill, from the very beginning. And that's another reason why I think the transition has been more than messy. It's been bloody and it's been unsuccessful.
What is el-Sisi's policy towards unity government of Fatah and Hamas and peace towards Israel?
Sure. Well, with regard to peace towards Israel, as I've said before, the Egyptian military, interestingly enough, has a better view of Israel than the Egyptian public. And they've had incredible security arrangements and intelligence sharing with Israel for years. You only need to read the WikiLeaks documents to see that, particularly under the Mubarak regime, but also now, and so on. Why is that the case? Because the Mubarak regime, like the Sisi regimes, sees Hamas as the enemy. They see Hamas as an Islamist entity same ideology of the Muslim Brotherhood and so on, and they oppose that very much. So with regard to Hamas Fatah, clearly they support Fatah over Hamas. And in fact, and this is again a side note, you'll remember that Egypt has often been involved in reconciliation talks between Fatah and Hamas, right? Well, I like to say that Egypt's role in the reconciliation talks under Mubarak, and probably in the future under this kind of a government, is similar to the United States' role in supposed negotiations between Palestinians and Israelis. They're hardly a neutral broker. And in fact, that's one of the reasons why Egyptian mediation efforts have continuously failed, because they support one party at the expense of the other, Fatah at the expense of Hamas.
Last but not least, and in light of the World Affairs Council planning a trip to Egypt in November, is it safe to travel to Egypt?
Yes, I think it is safe to travel to Egypt. I mean, I was just in Egypt, but that's a little bit different. I think that, as long as you stay away from Sinai, right, I think you will be...
We're not going to Sinai.
Yeah, you're not going to Sinai. You'll be fine. I mean, I encourage, everyone to go to Egypt and so on. Maybe a little bit more vigilance and a little bit more planning than in the previous era. But yes, I would encourage that.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shehata.
Thank you.